There are times when we feel our strength is running out, and the struggles and challenges of life become too heavy to bear. In these moments, we seek a source of strength and resilience to help us keep going. The good news, as Dr. Billy Graham often emphasized, is that Jesus has already taught us the secret to being strong and resilient even in the face of the greatest adversities. Throughout his life and ministry, Jesus not only spoke about strength and resilience, but also demonstrated through his action how we can find that inner fortitude. From the calmest moments to the darkest ones, he left us profound lessons revealing where the true source of our strength lies. Today we will explore 6 powerful secrets that Jesus, highlighted by Dr. Billy Graham, left for us to be strong and resilient in any circumstance. Each of these secrets is anchored in his own experiences and teachings, showing us the way to overcome with faith, trust, and obedience to God. The first secret is to trust in God at all times. From the very beginning of his ministry, Jesus showed us that true strength comes from complete trust in God, especially in the most challenging situations. One example illustrating this is when he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. In Matthew 4:1, after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus became hungry, something any human would experience. In that moment of vulnerability, the devil tried to exploit human weakness to divert Jesus, suggesting he turn stones into bread. But Jesus' response was clear and direct. It is written, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Matthew 4:4. This response was not just theoretical teaching, it was a practical demonstration that trust in God must be greater than any physical or material need. Even in the face of hunger, a basic necessity, Jesus did not place his trust in what was visible, but in the Word of God. This teaches us that in our moments of greatest fragility, that's when we should trust God the most. When it seems there is no way out, when solutions are beyond what we can see or control, trusting in God is what strengthens us. This same principle applies in many other instances in Jesus' life. When facing storms, both literal and figurative, his trust was firmly grounded in the sovereignty of God. Another significant example is in John 6:38, where Jesus makes it clear he did not come to do his own will, but the will of the Father who sent him. This shows us that in addition to trusting God, it is essential to live according to his will, even when that means surrendering our own desires. Still in the wilderness, the devil took Jesus to the highest point of the temple and tempted him again, suggesting he throw himself down because the angels would save him. Once again, Jesus responded with the word of God. It is also written, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." Matthew 4:7. Jesus didn't use his divine power to prove his identity. He didn't need to, because his trust in the Father was already complete. This shows us we don't need physical proof or signs to trust that God is in control. He always knows what's best and acts at the right time. Trusting in God is one of the most important pillars for developing strength and resilience. Sometimes we want to take control of situations and solve everything with our own strength, but that's not the way Jesus taught us. Trusting is placing control in God's hands and believing he has what's best for us, even if we can't see it at the moment. When we face tribulations, there's always the temptation to seek quick solutions or rely on our wisdom. But as Jesus taught us in the wilderness, true strength lies in waiting on the Lord. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." This means that trusting in God gives us renewed strength, a strength that doesn't come from us but from him. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of people who, even in their greatest difficulties, trusted God and were strengthened and empowered to face adversity. David, for instance, faced giants, not because he was strong himself, but because he trusted in the God who guided him. In 1 Samuel 17:45, when David confronts Goliath, he declares, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. David's confidence wasn't in his abilities or weapons, but in God, and it was this trust that led him to victory. The same principle applies to our daily lives when we face giants, whether financial problems, illnesses, emotional crises, or other challenges. We must remember our strength doesn't come from solving these situations, but from our trust in God. Proverbs 3:5-6 teaches us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." This verse calls us to place all our trust in the Lord in every aspect of our lives, and he will guide us on the right path. Trusting God also means accepting we won't always understand everything he does or allows. There are times when God's ways seem incomprehensible, but it's in those moments that trust must be stronger. Jesus showed us this in various situations. When Lazarus died, many questioned why Jesus hadn't healed him earlier. But Jesus, trusting God's plan, said in John 11:4, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." At the right moment, Lazarus was raised from the dead, demonstrating that trust in God's timing and plans always results in something greater than we can imagine. Finally, it's important to remember trusting God is a continuous process, not a one-time act. With each new challenge and difficulty, we are called to renew our trust. In Philippians 4:6-7, Paul exhorts us, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." This teaches us that by fully trusting God, we experience peace that goes beyond circumstances, a peace that comes from him and strengthens us to face any situation. The second secret is to pray constantly. Jesus, as Dr. Billy Graham often pointed out, left us a clear example that prayer is essential for strength and resilience. It wasn't just something he taught his disciples, but something he practiced intensely in his own life. From the start of his ministry, we see Jesus withdrawing to pray at crucial moments. A significant example is his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, one of the most intense and emotional moments of his journey. In Matthew 26:36-46, knowing what was to come, Jesus withdrew to pray, taking Peter, James, and John with him. There he expressed his anguish to the Father, saying, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Matthew 26:38. This moment teaches us that in life's most difficult situations, prayer connects us directly to God and strengthens us. Jesus prayed 3 times in that garden, showing that prayer isn't a one-time event, but a continuous action. His persistence highlights maintaining constant dialogue with God, especially in anguish and uncertainty. He asked the Father to take the cup of suffering away if possible, but also surrendered his will, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26:39. This total surrender is an example of how prayer helps us align our hearts with God's will, even if that will involves challenges. This episode in Gethsemane also shows us that prayer is a source of spiritual strength. While Jesus prayed, the disciples fell asleep despite his request to keep watch and pray. This shows us that without prayer, it's easy to succumb to fatigue and weakness, but prayer renews us. After praying, Jesus was ready to face what was coming, while his disciples who did not pray were confused and lost when confronted with the situation. Another powerful example of the importance of prayer in Jesus' life is when he spent the night in prayer before choosing his 12 disciples. In Luke 6:12-13, we read that Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night in prayer to God. When morning came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them. This moment shows that even in important life decisions, Jesus fully trusted God's direction through prayer. He didn't make decisions hastily or based on his own wisdom, but sought God's guidance first. As Jesus taught us, prayer should not be limited to moments of distress, but should be part of our entire lives. The Apostle Paul reminds us of this in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, where he exhorts us to pray without ceasing. This means our lives should be permeated with an attitude of prayer, a continuous conversation with God. It's not necessary to always be in a specific place or position to pray. We can pray as we walk, work, and face daily challenges. Prayer keeps us connected to God, and this connection strengthens us and gives us resilience to face trials. At another point in Jesus' life, we see how he often withdrew to pray in solitary places. Luke 5:16 records that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. This habit of seeking solitude to be alone with the Father shows that prayer is also a moment of personal renewal and strengthening. Even amidst his intense mission, surrounded by crowds and many needing his help, Jesus always found time to withdraw and pray. This teaches us that amidst responsibilities and daily activities, it's essential to set aside moments of quiet to pray, reflect, and listen to God's voice. Prayer not only strengthens us, but also gives us clarity and discernment. Dr. Billy Graham demonstrated this when he emphasized prayer before making important decisions, as Jesus did when choosing the disciples. This teaches us that when we face moments of uncertainty, instead of trusting our own ability to discern what's best, we should seek God's guidance through prayer. Prayer opens our spiritual eyes and allows us to see beyond immediate circumstances. Another significant moment in Jesus' life related to prayer is in Luke 11:1, when one of the disciples, after seeing him pray, asked, "Lord, teach us to pray," just as John taught his disciples. This request shows that Jesus' own disciples recognized the importance of prayer in his life and wanted to learn to pray as he did. It was in this context that Jesus taught the famous Lord's Prayer, which serves as a model for all of us. The Lord's Prayer teaches us to revere God, seek his will, ask for daily provision, plead for forgiveness and protection. This prayer summarizes the essential elements of an effective prayer life. Additionally, Jesus also gave us the parable of the unjust judge to teach about the importance of persistence in prayer. In Luke 18:1-8, Jesus tells the story of a widow who persistently asked a judge for justice, even though he neither feared God nor cared about people. Although the judge initially ignored her requests, he eventually gave in because of her persistence. Jesus used this parable to teach that we should always pray and never give up. He concludes by saying, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night?" This parable teaches us that persistent prayer is powerful and that God in his time will answer our pleas. Therefore, prayer is not just a religious practice, it's a relationship with God. It strengthens us, gives us resilience, and keeps us connected to the Father in all circumstances. Jesus showed us through his life that prayer is the secret to remaining steadfast even in the face of the greatest adversities. Dr. Billy Graham often highlighted this in his teachings on spiritual resilience. The third secret is serving others. Jesus taught us that true strength and resilience often come through serving others. In many situations, he showed that the path to greatness is not in being served, but in serving. A clear example of this attitude from Jesus is when he washed his disciples' feet in John 13:1. During the Last Supper, Jesus did something that surprised everyone. He, the Master and Lord, got up, took a towel, knelt before his disciples, and began washing their feet. Peter initially refused because he didn't understand why Jesus himself was doing such a humble task. However, Jesus explained the importance of that act. In John 13:14-15, Jesus said, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Here Jesus shows us that serving others is not a sign of weakness, but of inner strength and confidence, in our identity in God. Even though he was the Son of God, he did not feel diminished by performing this humble act. On the contrary, he demonstrated that true greatness lies in serving. Serving others is an act of love that strengthens us spiritually because it shifts our focus away from our own difficulties and puts us in a position of empathy and compassion for others. In Mark 10:45, Jesus stated, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." This verse highlights that Jesus' mission from the very beginning was marked by service. He did not seek status, recognition, or comfort, but dedicated his life for the good of others. Moreover, serving teaches us to develop resilience that goes beyond ourselves. When we focus on helping someone, we find strength even when we feel weak. This is because by attending to others' needs, we are renewed through the very act of giving. The Apostle Paul reminds us of this in Galatians 6:9 through 10, where he writes, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." Jesus himself, on various occasions, demonstrated that service is a way to fulfill God's purpose on earth. When he fed the crowd of 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, as narrated in Matthew 14:3-21, he not only performed a miracle, but also taught us the power of serving the needs of others, even when resources seem limited. Jesus could have sent the crowd away, but he chose to serve, trusting that God would provide what was needed to feed everyone present. Another important point is that serving others helps us develop humility. In Philippians 2:3-4, Paul urges us, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others." By serving, we learn to prioritize the needs of others above our own, and this strengthens us emotionally and spiritually because our lives begin to reflect Christ's love in a practical way. Jesus also left us the example that service should be done without expecting anything in return. In Luke 6:35, he teaches us to love our enemies and do good without expecting anything back. This is resilience in its purest form, continuing to do good even when there is no recognition or immediate reward. This attitude strengthens us internally because it frees us from the need for approval and validation from others, focusing solely on pleasing God. Service also prepares us to face life's adversities with greater courage. When we are accustomed to putting ourselves at others' disposal, we practice an act of surrender. In Matthew 25:35-40, Jesus teaches us that by feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming strangers, and clothing the needy, we are actually serving Christ himself. He said, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Matthew 25:40. This shows us that serving others is also a way to deeply connect with Jesus, strengthening our spirit and our faith. When Jesus called his disciples, he invited them to a life of service. In Matthew 20:26-28, he said, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus makes it clear that the path to true greatness lies in service. By living out this principle, we find a source of strength that the world cannot offer. This strength does not come from recognition or power, but from the simple act of blessing others. Furthermore, serving helps us develop a long-term vision. By investing our time and energy to help others, we are planting seeds that we may not see the fruits of immediately, but Jesus reminds us that sincere service will always be rewarded by God. In Hebrews 6:10, it is written, "God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them." This gives us the assurance that our effort to serve is not in vain. and that God in His time will bring the reward. Therefore, serving others is one of the most powerful ways to be strong and resilient in life. It shifts us from a stance of self-protection and teaches us to live selflessly just as Jesus did. Through service, we find purpose, spiritual growth, and the strength to face the challenges that come our way. The fourth secret is having faith in difficult times. Jesus, in His journey on earth, left many examples of how faith is essential to navigate the most adverse situations. During moments of uncertainty and tribulation, He always demonstrated that faith in God is what sustains us. One episode that clearly illustrates this is the occasion when He and His disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee. In Matthew 8:23 through 27, we read that Jesus was in the boat with His disciples when a great storm arose. The wind and the waves were so strong that the boat seemed about to sink. Meanwhile, Jesus slept peacefully. Desperate, the disciples woke Him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." Matthew 8:25. Jesus, upon waking, rebuked them for their lack of faith before calming the storm. "Why are you so afraid, you of little faith?" Matthew 8:26. Then He got up and with a simple word commanded the wind and the sea to calm, and there was great peace. This moment teaches us that in times of greatest distress, when everything around us seems to be falling apart, faith is what keeps us grounded. Even when circumstances are frightening and fear tries to overwhelm us, Jesus calls us to trust in God, for He is in control, even when we cannot see an immediate solution. For Dr. Billy Graham, this story was a profound illustration of the power of faith during trials. Jesus' faith was not just an abstract feeling or something to be spoken about during peaceful times. It was active trust in God's goodness and power, regardless of the situation. Another powerful example of how Jesus connected faith with resilience in the face of challenges is in the episode where He healed the woman with the issue of blood. In Mark 5:25 to 34, we find the story of a woman who had suffered from an illness for 12 years. She had spent all she had on treatments without success, but upon hearing about Jesus, she decided that if she could just touch His clothes, she would be healed. With faith, she approached Him in the crowd and touched the edge of His garment. Immediately, she was healed. Jesus, realizing that He had been touched, said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Mark 5:34. This story teaches us that even in situations that seem impossible, faith brings us into direct contact with God's power. That woman, despite years of suffering, did not lose her faith. She believed that with a simple act of trust, she could receive healing, and that's exactly what happened. Dr. Billy Graham often reflected on this story as a testament to enduring faith in adversity. Faith, therefore, is a force that propels us beyond our limits and helps us find strength in God's power to face what seems insurmountable. Dr. Billy Graham also teaches us that faith is powerful even when it seems small. In Matthew 17:20, he says, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." The comparison with a mustard seed is significant because this seed is extremely small, yet it grows to become one of the largest plants in the garden. This teaches us that it's not the size of our faith that matters, but in whom we place that faith. Even the smallest amount of faith, when placed in God, can move mountains. So, when we face difficulties, even if our faith seems fragile, we must remember that God is powerful to act, and that gives us strength to keep moving forward. Moreover, faith in difficult times not only helps us overcome challenges, but also brings us peace amid the storm. In John 14:27, Jesus said to His disciples, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." The peace that Jesus offers does not depend on external circumstances, but comes from trust in God. When we have faith, we can experience that peace even when everything around us seems chaotic. It is faith that allows us to rest in the assurance that God is with us, that He has a plan, and that nothing is beyond His control. Jesus often praised those who showed great faith, even in times of great suffering. One example of this is in Matthew 15:28, when a Canaanite woman whose daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came to Jesus begging for help. Initially, Jesus did not respond, and the disciples asked Him to send her away. But the woman persisted, showing unwavering faith. Jesus finally said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." Matthew 15:28, and her daughter was healed. At that moment, this story shows us that even when it seems like God is silent or distant, our faith must remain firm. This woman's persistence in seeking Jesus' help, even in the face of obstacles, is a clear example of resilience rooted in faith. Faith also allows us to see beyond present difficulties and look to the future with hope. The author of Hebrews reminds us of this in Hebrews 11:1, where we read, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Even when we cannot see the solution, faith gives us the certainty that God is working on our behalf. When we trust in Him, we can face any situation with courage, knowing that He is with us every step of the way. Thus, faith is not just a refuge in times of difficulty, it is also the force that propels us forward. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, as described in John 11:44, He asked Martha, Lazarus' sister, an important question. "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? John 11:25-26. Martha replied affirmatively, showing her faith, and Jesus, in response to that trust, brought her brother back to life. This passage teaches us that even in the face of death, faith in Jesus is what sustains us and gives us hope. Therefore, faith is the foundation of resilience. It allows us to face life's storms with confidence, keeps us grounded when everything around us seems to be crumbling, and gives us the assurance that no matter what we face, God is in control, just as Jesus demonstrated in His life. Faith does not remove challenges, but equips us to go through them with strength and peace. Garden of Gethsemane. In Luke 22:42, shortly before His arrest and crucifixion, Jesus prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." This prayer of Jesus, as Dr. Billy Graham reflects, reveals the tension between the human desire to avoid suffering and obedience to God's will. He did not ignore that the path ahead would be difficult and painful, but even so, He chose to submit to what the Father had planned. By saying, "Not my will, but yours," Jesus teaches us that true resilience lies in trusting that God's plans are perfect, even when we don't fully understand or stand them, or when they seem contrary to our desires. Accepting God's will requires total surrender and deep trust in His purpose. Another example of how accepting God's will strengthens us is found in the story of Abraham in Genesis 22:1-9. God asked Abraham to do something seemingly incomprehensible, to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham did not question or resist God's command. Even in the face of such a painful task, he obeyed, trusting that God had a plan, even if he couldn't see or understand it at the time. At the last moment, God intervened and provided a ram for the sacrifice, showing Abraham that his faith and obedience were not in vain. This story teaches us that by accepting God's will, even when it seems difficult, we are empowered to see His provision and care in our lives. Accepting God's will also involves letting go of our own plans and expectations. In Proverbs 16:9, we read, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." This reminds us that no matter how much we plan and try to control situations, it is God who directs our steps. Sometimes our plans are disrupted, our desires are not fulfilled, and things don't happen as we imagine. In these situations, Jesus, as Dr. Billy Graham often noted, teaches us to trust that God's ways are higher and wiser than ours. What may seem like a loss or a temporary failure is often part of a bigger and more perfect plan that God has for us. Acceptance of God's will is not passive. It requires action and faith. When Jesus called Peter to walk on water in Matthew 14:22-3, he challenged him to trust completely in his word and power. Peter began to walk, but when he looked at the wind and waves around him, he became afraid and started to sink. Jesus rescued him and asked, "Why did you doubt?" This episode teaches us that accepting God's will also means keeping our focus on Him, even when the circumstances around us seem threatening. If we take our eyes off Jesus and focus on the difficulties, we begin to falter. But when we trust fully in His will, we are strengthened to continue, no matter the storms we face. Another important aspect of accepting God's will is recognizing that often He calls us to wait. In Psalm 27:14, we are encouraged to wait for the Lord, be strong, and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Waiting can be one of the hardest challenges. When we are going through moments of uncertainty or pain, we want quick answers and immediate solutions. But God, in His wisdom, often asks us to wait. This waiting is not empty, but is a time of growth, maturity, and spiritual strengthening. While we wait, we are called to trust that God is working in our lives, even when we cannot see what He is doing. The story of Job is also a powerful example of how accepting God's will strengthens us. Job faced immense losses, his health, his family, and his possessions. Yet he continued to trust in God in the midst of his suffering. Job said, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Job 1:21. This acceptance of God's sovereignty in all things, both good and bad, shows the depth of Job's faith. He knew that regardless of the circumstances, God was in control and His plan was greater than any temporary pain. In the end, God restored everything Job had lost, but the greatest gift was the spiritual growth and unshakable faith that he developed by accepting God's will in every stage of his life. Jesus also taught us to pray for God's will in our lives. In the Lord's Prayer, He instructed us to say, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Matthew 6:10. This shows us that as we seek God's will in our lives, we are aligning ourselves with His kingdom and His greater purpose. We don't pray for our own desires to be fulfilled, but for God's plans to be accomplished in us and through us. This surrender strengthens us because we know that God's plans are always for our good and for His glory, as it says in Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Finally, accepting God's will is an ongoing act of faith. In every new season of life, in every challenge or unexpected change, we are called to renew this trust. Jesus, as Dr. Billy Graham emphasized, showed us that even when God's will seems difficult to bear, it always brings forth the fruits of peace, joy, and restoration. When we accept God's will, we find true resilience because we are no longer fighting against circumstances, but trusting that God is in control of everything. We have reached the end of this reflection on the secrets Jesus left us to be strong and resilient in life. We have seen how trusting in God, praying constantly, serving others, having faith in difficult times, forgiving from the heart, and accepting God's will are the paths that sustain us in any circumstance. These teachings are not just words, but powerful truths that, when applied to our lives, transform the way we face daily challenges. If this message spoke to your heart, I invite you to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving reflections that will help you grow spiritually and live closer to God. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone you know who also needs these words of encouragement. Together we can spread the light of Christ and strengthen each other in faith. May God bless your life and give you the strength needed to face any situation. See you in the next video.